stupid camera cut off again. Anyway, I was halfway in making a point there. ESP versus Gibson, like if it says not LTD, not Elite 2, ESP, actual ESP versus Gibson. ESPs are ridiculously expensive, the same way some Gibsons are, right? So when people say, "Oh, Gibson's overpriced," yeah, but some of the Fenders are way overpriced too. You know, are they really worth that? Like, to tell you the truth, I picked up and played a Fender made in Mexico, Strat. You know, the base model Fender, and you can compare it to a $10,000 Fender, and if there's a difference, it's like that much. You know, for those features, right? You might get a little extra with the $10,000, but you pay this much more, but you get this much more. Gibson's the same, ESP's the same. Like, if you take my PRS SE model Mark Holcomb 6-string, okay, and compare it to any ESP ever made, how will it stack up? It'll probably stack up pretty good. I'm not going to say it's going to be better than every ESP. What I'm saying is that from the very best, most refined ESP between that guitar and my $1,300 Mark Holcomb guitar, PRS SE model, there's like that much of a difference. You know what I mean? And between the base model PRS SE 20 Custom 24 and my Mark Holcomb guitar, which is about $300 more, there's that much difference. You know what I mean? It's just I like the Mark Holcomb guitar because it's a little more. There's a few features on it that I like. That 20-inch fretboard radius is just so slides and bends, guys. If you put like classic pickups, like say like classic 57s or something like that, or burst buckers in the Mark Holcomb guitar, the blues guys that love doing these crazy BB King style bends or whatever, or Buddy Guy bends, or just sit there on one note, just bending the shit out of the string. You're never going to get a guitar that can bend a string easier. And at the nut, right? There's no guitar I've ever played other than guitars with the 20-inch fretboards that bend well at the nut. You know, it's down, up at the heel, no problem. But to do like one of those really crazy Mark Holcomb style squeal bends that he does, it's there. I think Mark Holcomb's squeal bends are even crazier than Dimebag Darrell's and Zakk Wylde's. Right? Zakk Wylde bends one. He does the G note. That's it. You know, yeah, that's the easy one to do, but Mark Holcomb does it at the first fret on the F. Mind you, he's down-tuned a lot of times, too, so it makes it a little easier, right? But there's a couple of really cool bends that Mark Holcomb does with his guitars that he got the idea from another guy, and it's kind of like you bend and then you squeal, and then it instead of go, woo, it's like, ew. it's can't do the sound, but you get the idea. It's really cool, is what I'm saying. But yeah, overpriced versus getting bang for buck. I'm always one of those guys that bang for the buck is always what I go after. And the first thing I look at in a guitar is playability, right? And once you have really good playability, it's really hard to justify everything else unless there's something really, really changing. Like, for example, my SGs have classic 57s in them, which sound great when you're playing straight through the amp. But for extreme high gain, they get a little bit muddy, right? Because they're vintage sounding pickup. They sound great. It's my favorite sounding vintage humbucker for sure is the classic 57. But for modern metal, I think the Duncan distortions are my favorite right now. And I've tried quite a few Duncans on different, all kinds of Damasios and stuff like that over the years in different guitars, just to, okay, well, I like this over that. But the Duncan distortions seem to work for me. But the Alpha and Omegas, I really like them too. But I think the character of the Duncan distortions is a little more thrash metal, where the Alpha and Omegas are just like, okay, they're really high gain, but they're very, very, kind of flat response, very, very neutral, which makes them really good with effects, right? Because they're just, you can really shape the tone to whatever you want, where the Duncan distortion kind of has a bit more character to it, if that makes sense. But like going from my Jackson Flying V or my Mark Holcomb guitars to say like a Telecaster or a Stratocaster, then I got some range and tones that are totally different. But I also want like an Ibanez, another Ibanez. It's just the Ibanez it's the problem with the Ibanez is the money you're paying for guitars that are made out of cheap materials. You know what I mean? Don't get me wrong, Ibanez's are made awesome. I've had enough Ibanez's that I can tell you, and I've played enough of them that they're awesome. But bang for the buck. If you're going to be paying that kind of money, maybe you want to have a look at a Charvel, maybe, or some of the Jacksons. I find the Jacksons are the best sounding for metal and stuff like that because they tend to have the hotter pickups. The Ibanez's tend to be the best players, right? And the Charvel somewhere in between. It has the sound of the Jackson, but the playability of the Ibanez, right? So there's kind of like, in general, we're talking in general, there's so many makes and models of guitars, you can't compare them all equally, right? But like if you were to take, say, the RG series Ibanez, put it up against a Jackson Soloist, the average Jackson Soloist, the average RG, and then of course the Charvel line, those are your super shredder guitars right there. They're not necessarily going to be the heavy guitars. The heavy sounding guitars are something different. That's like your LTD stuff. Your LTDs are dark sounding. They're really, really dark sounding. Gibson Les Paul with the right pickups in it. Right now, if you're a metal guy and you really like Gibson Les Pauls, the Tool guitar player, his signature model, I think that thing sounds the best. I think that's the best sounding modern Les Paul sound I've heard. The Slash guitar sounds pretty cool, but this thing I think sounds even better to my ears. If you're willing to pay that money, because it already has the hot rod pickup in it, which is just slightly hotter than a Duncan Distortion. And the Epiphone version has the Duncan Distortion in it, right? Which is a great, it's a great pickup. So I got the modern metal sounds covered. I am really working on like my neoclassical playing, and I'm trying to really stay away from that mid 80s to, or late 70s to mid 80s, late 80s, pentatonic rock guitar player. Love Van Halen, love AC, Angus Young, love Nuno, love all those guys. They're just fantastic players. Rhodes, love Rhodes. All that, but they all really, really, when you really listen to anything from the 1980s, Jakey Lee, same thing. Zakk Wylde's probably the worst for the pentatonic scale. It's the Chuck Berry riff over and over and over again, right? And that's fine, like it sounds good. It's just, I'm trying to get away from those sounds. The Joe Satriani sound, the Lydian scale, and the Mixolydian scale stuff. Steve Vai, Joe Satriani, Lydian scale, Mixolydian scale. I'm still staying like in Phrygian and Dorian modes, all the minor modes or whatever. But I want to get into like some really crazy, really, bright sounding major scale stuff too. But like I don't want to sound like Joe Satriani, Steve Vai, or Eddie Van Halen as much. Although I love those guitar players and they were big influences on me and stuff like that. Jimi Hendrix, basically pentatonic scale. Everybody from 1960 that's all they played was the pentatonic scale, because most of the guitar players that are not musically trained, 90% of them will just naturally develop a form of pentatonic scale, right? So I've been really in the past 2 years, my journey started in 2019 of trying to become more modern sounding, breaking my 1970s, 1980s rocker sound. And I'll be honest with you, not easy. I mean, rewiring your brain to play differently instead of because you're going against your instinct to sound a certain way, where you just naturally go to that, where I'm now naturally going to more of a neoclassical Hungarian minor, Phrygian dominant, the Phrygian mode, stuff like. I'm starting to go into those modes more. Diminished scales, I've always been a big fan. George Lynch is a very diminished. He's a pentatonic player. He's a 70s rocker guy. So he does his guitar solos have a lot of that pentatonic stuff in it, the same way like Rhodes and all that. But his rhythms